Hi guys, welcome back to me on YouTube. This is Daniel Rosehill. I set up a new YouTube channel a couple of months ago called Daniel Rosehill Plus because I was attempting to get my YouTube channel in some kind of order and keep it focused on specific themes and whatnot, rather than posting one day about MDiscs, the next day about this. So I'm trying to keep it that way for the moment. And I'm actually doing the first time I've done something like a video blog or vlog in a long time. It is currently approximately 4 a.m. in Israel, which means that I am officially suffering from something I'm going to call geopolitical insomnia. And for you, dear YouTube subscribers, it means you get for the first time to see me decked out in my lovely new tartan pajamas. So I want to talk. I was attempting to get to sleep. I was trying counting sheep, and then I was reading political threads on Twitter, which is never recommended. So this is what I've ultimately resigned myself to. Sleep will overtake me when it overtakes me tonight, but probably only after I have unleashed or unloaded my thoughts about what's going on into the webcam. So that's what's really kind of getting to me, and I think a lot of people right now, is there's so much going on in Israel at the moment. Is coming from all sides. Having lived in Israel for 8 years, there's always a sort of steady train of news coming out of Israel. There's our political situation. Right now, we have a flare-up in the political situation here, and we also have these judicial reform proposals, which might not sound like a big thing, but Israel's president came on national TV 2 nights ago, which basically never happens, to say, and I'm going to look for the quotes here. This is a direct quote from Israel's president, Herzog, who's kind of a tepid, figurehead. The role of the president's a figurehead. He's kind of a pretty tepid guy. And he said, quote, "We are on the verge of constitutional and social collapse. This is an emergency." So when the president of the country is coming on the TV to do like an emergency broadcast to say the constitution's collapsing, it does make you think that serious things are going on, and really serious things are going on. In addition to this, and that's we're going to talk about this, we have the ongoing sort of deterioration in our security situation. There was a horrible terrorist attack in Jerusalem on Friday, which killed 2 siblings, 14 and 7. 14. Sorry, I've got the ages wrong here. They're in my little notes I scrambled together. Worse, 6 and 8. The 8-year-old died after the 6-year-old, and a 20-year-old. So 3 fatalities at that car ramming event. It was a car ramming attack in which basically a Palestinian drove in, obviously intentionally sped up to kill people, which has been a tactic they've been using for years. It occurred near Ramot in Jerusalem, and that's horrible. And just today, there's been 2 more attacks, and it's getting to the point that it's like hard to keep up. Most of these attacks, these kind of what are called lone wolf attacks, they're not the casualty count might be relatively small, and they're not organized by a big cell and a big explosion, so they kind of evade the attention of the world media. But just today, we had a 14-year-old boy was arrested on Monday as a suspect in a terrorist attack after a man was stabbed and wounded. So we're seeing recently a trend of these lone wolf attacks being carried out by younger Palestinian assailants, in this case 14. The victim was 17. And then we also had a fatal attack today in Shuafat refugee camp, in which a border policeman by the name of Asil Suaid was killed by a stabber. The stabber was only 13. We had another attack a couple of weeks ago in which followed a day of 2 attacks in the old city, and the second one was again a 13-year-old. So this is quite unusual. Typically, these lone wolf attacks in Israel are, if there's any trend that can be deciphered about them, it's that they tend to be kind of young men, 18 in their 20s, let's say the stereotypical angry young men. And to see literally teenagers carrying out the attacks kind of just adds a whole new weird dimension to it. And anyway, I want to talk about the judicial reform protest. I'm actually hearing garbage trucks going on outside, which makes me think it may be even later than I thought here. The judicial reform protest, I did a video today in which I interviewed a few people I only stayed at the protest for an hour or two, and I must admit that was sort of intentional. These were billed as the major protests that if you were going to come out and protest, come today. It's going to happen all over Israel. There was a huge push for it, but they've actually been going on for 4 or 5 weeks. Now, what these protests are about is essentially these tabled reforms to Israel's judiciary. The system of courts, and to the best of my knowledge, and it's super complicated, there's the Israel Democracy Institute has an explainer in English. A guy I follow on Twitter, and I really, really appreciate his tweets, a guy called Shael Ben Ephraim. I'll try to remember to put a link in the video description to his podcast. He recently started a podcast called Israel Explained, and he has 2 episodes, specifically episodes 3 about the Constitution and 4 about the proposals, that are amazing. If you have 1 hour to spare, listen to these 2 episodes and you'll get a much better understanding. At least for me, it really enhanced it, because being there at the protest today, there's a ton of confusion. What exactly is being proposed? So here's the best as I understand it. It's a twofold potential change to Israel's system of democracy. Firstly, the way in which the Supreme Court justices are appointed. The government's going to get majority control over the committee that does that process, which is dangerous because it means that the government can appoint friendly puppet, one might say, justices to the Supreme Court. All this is kind of made worse by the fact that Israel is already, in terms of its separation of powers, a little bit shaky. There's only one house to its parliament. Direct democracy, like referenda, has never been a thing here. And in addition to all of that, we have basically a constitution that isn't one document, but is spread over this corpus of law called basic law. And the basic laws kind of together form a constitution, but, it's generally a lot less. Constitutional law, I think, is weaker when you don't have a single constitution. When you have a single constitution, everyone from constitutional lawyers to people interested in their country, can pick up a copy of the Constitution and go out with their friends and debate the fundamental characters of that state. And when it's kind of spread over 13, 14 laws, it gets a lot harder for people to even know, well, what's in the Constitution. So those are some of the problems that we have. Now, the second and the more problematic part of the proposal is what's called the override clause. So one of the main functions of a judiciary in most jurisdictions, many jurisdictions, is judicial review or constitutional review. So obviously courts hear law cases, and that's the core of their work. But there's also this principle that kind of emerged in, if I'm not mistaken, in the US in the 19th century, very much associated with American jurisprudence, somewhat less so in Europe, where there have been countries who've pushed back against it. And it's this concept that, well, the government, whether it's a single house legislator or a bicameral legislator, or we're looking at the enactments of local government, there is a mechanism through the court system whereby someone, whether it's Joe Bloggs or and sometimes someone who is directly affected by that law, can actually sue the state, arguing that it's not constitutional, and the court can change it. That's called generally striking down. When the court strikes down a law or whatever for not being constitutional, that's just the word that is used. So the proposal in Israel is to basically, there's a couple of proposals that have been tabled, and there's been developments tonight that I haven't even followed, like throughout the night. There were last minute negotiations about this. One version of the proposals is basically that the Knesset will no longer be able to overrule legislation. So if legislation is passed, there will not be the ability to have any judicial review. And then there's another one that if it's only a change to basic laws, will judicial review be a thing, because the basic laws are effectively a quasi-constitution. So there's a couple of ways this could go. If it's the override clause, whereby the Knesset can't declare any law unconstitutional, whether a basic law or a run-of-the-mill law, then the constitution, then the judiciary, added to the fact that they're potentially political puppets, let's say, is weakened to the point of it acting as a check and balance in the system of democracy is kind of gone out the window. It'll still be a court system, and it'll still be a Supreme Court, but in terms of actually being an organ of government that can challenge the judiciary, gone. So that's the big concern. I'm on take 2 of this vlog already, so forgive me if I mention this, but we did have the president come on the radio a couple of days ago saying, in quotes, "We are on the verge of a constitutional and social collapse." He's also saying we're on the verge of a civil war, and it's kind of not hard to see when you look at what happened today. There was 100,000 people came out to Jerusalem, which to me sounded like maybe that was the biggest protest in the history of the country. It wasn't. Actually, the 2011 social justice protest managed to bring 450,000 people, 200,000 in Tel Aviv alone, out to protest the insane cost of living. So there was actually more there, but this was still a very, very big protest indeed. So that is what's going on. And as I mentioned, we're having simultaneously to deal with this wave of attacks, and it's very hard to keep your eye on both issues at the same time. Israel is simultaneously sending out aid teams to Turkey and Syria, or has been, and one of the teams just came back because they were threatened by a concrete threat. So every time you turn on the news at the moment about Israel, it's getting like worse and crazier, and it's a little bit very unsettling. Let's not call it not that. So I want to talk about what I saw today myself at the judicial reform protest. I went for a couple of hours, and just one opinion that I kind of wanted to get out there, even if no one on the internet listens to it, and it's just what I think. What we're going to see, if worst case scenario judicial review is gone out the window, Israel's still going to be democracy. So there's been this argument that, this is the impending death of Israeli democracy. And I just want to say, I think that's a little bit exaggerated. The definition of democracy being the will of the people exercised through free elections does not hinge upon judicial review being a thing. Judicial review is kind of a bolstering to the democratic process. It's separating out the power between a legislature and a government and an executive, and a judiciary, but it's not an essential component of the system. So the way I'm looking at it is, worst case scenario, Israel is going to become a more autocratic country. And to me, Israel's always had this weird duality of attempting to be the Jewish state and the democratic state, and relatively few questions being asked about are those two things compatible. Now, without sounding like a crazy religious fundamentalist, if the conception of the Jewish people who've reestablished Israel, Zionists, etc., the millions of people like me who've come here to make the Jewish state a reality again from 1948 onwards, if we're doing so because we're like, this existed at the time of the Bible and this is our homeland and we want to do this thing again, there's a question that never seems to get asked about, what's the kind of system of governance we'd like for ourselves? Before we just say Israel is going to be a model democracy after Western nations, and if judicial review is something the Americans do, then, that's for sure has to be part of our version of democracy. So I think that's an open-ended question that deserves discussion. If we look back at the system of governance that was there in the times of the Bible, some people would say that's lunatic. You want to become a full-fledged theocracy. That's your prerogative, Israel. But I think it's worth even saying at a more moderate level, is democracy really a thing that Judaism is on board with in its modern conception? So that's the kind of debate we're having at the moment, and we're seeing the fact that we have a government that's formed a coalition, a very right-wing coalition, and they have tabled these reforms to the judiciary basically, and it seems like to get them out of the way essentially. And as they're doing so, a lot of things are changing very quickly. I'll get on to one of those, and that is that Israel today, amongst just to make the chaos more in addition to the 2 terrorist attacks, in addition to the attack on Friday, in addition to these protests today, Israel today announced that it was going to legalize retrospectively 9 settlements in the West Bank that were previously deemed illegal. And it was expressly doing these as revenge or in response to the Palestinian terrorism on Friday, which, again, because my brain is a little bit confused between the takes and the hour, resulted in the deaths of a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, a very heinous attack, and a third victim who was 20. And again, the 13-year-old Palestinian terrorist today, killing a border policeman in Shuafat, and a 14-year-old stabbing and wounding someone in the old city. So Israel decides today to say, well, you know what? Screw you guys for killing our citizens, for killing children. That's disgusting. That's abhorrent. Boom, here you go. 9 new settlements that we're going to just retrospectively authorize. Now, firstly, I have to get my opinion out on this. I think that's a horrible... I have actually an easier time getting on board with home demolitions, which is also a controversial practice of Israel, whereby if a terrorist attacks, kills, their home gets demolished because it's a direct punishment as such for the terrorists. When you randomly legalize it, places that were, according to the international community, illegal, and even according to Israeli law, illegally done, they weren't done with. And when you just take out a magic wand and say legal, they're legal because of the attacks, it really seems like Banana Republic stuff to me, like in a big way. And also kind of makes this whole thing even harder to stomach, because on the one hand, we're having these sort of, philosophical arguments about the judicial review and the separation of powers. And then a few hours later, we're seeing this like wacko stuff of magic brush legalization. Now, the connection I wanted to make here was that this is going to face a challenge, right? The government can say, this is what we're going to do. And then that could be challenged through the court system. And you see the problem here with the weakening of the court system is every time the court system might say you can't do that. Now, if these proposals are passed, it's going to be a lot easier for that resistance to not be there, because the court will be effectively sort of neutered. So there is a connection between those two issues. I'm going to conclude, because I'm at the 17-minute mark here. I'm going to conclude with just some observations from what I saw today for the 2 hours that I was there or so at the protest. I spoke to a number of people. The video, I'll put a link to it in the description, the one where I sort of actually attempt to interview people. There's some people I didn't get to, unfortunately. I tried to interview someone from high tech. High tech is one of those Israelisms that means basically the technology sector. I've asked the central statistics body before in Israel, the CBS, in Hebrew and in English, what do you define as high tech for the purpose of collating your statistics? Because they give a high tech average and an average and a national average, and the high tech one is usually far above it in terms of pay. The answer is related to the percentage of the workforce dedicated to research and development, R&D. So high tech you can think of as the software companies, the ones, the Israeli companies IPOing on the NASDAQ, the ones that have transformed Israel from a socialist backwater to a thriving tech economy. That's what people mean basically by high tech. And there was a lot of t-shirts at the event and flags for high tech. They had the banner. I can't remember actually what their slogan was in Hebrew. In Chufsha, in high tech. There's no freedom of democracy. Isn't this form of democracy? Well, high tech's not going to exist. It's tricky to exactly understand what their argument is, but there's a couple of strands to it. Firstly, they're arguing that Israel's international reputation is going to go down the toilet if these laws are passed, and the people realize that, well, there's really no judicial review in Israel. There's really no checks and balances in Israel's system of governance. And it's a strongman country led by an autocratic leader and his far-right coalition partners. That's not a good investment environment, or that's an investment environment that would change a lot of people's perception of Israel from international investors who might up to now have thought that, well, there's far right aspects to Israel's government, but there's a very, very strong left wing and a secular wing and a strong tech economy all associated together, and they sort of balance it out. We're comfortable with the fact that there's a dialogue in Israel. This is kind of killing the pushback, the pull and give in the Israeli system of governance, that there's just going to be a far right government pretty much doing what it wants. So that's the concern there. Is there's going to be a chilling effect on high tech, and specifically investment in the high tech companies. The VC money dries up and Israel's in trouble. Basically, the major engine of its economic growth is gone. So there was also, besides high tech folk who I didn't get to speak to, but that's roughly as I understand it what their arguments are. Academia as well was interesting. I did get to speak to one academic, and she was saying her concern is, in this potential legislative environment in which the government can kind of do what it wants, freedom of speech is going to go out the window. And of course, to be a credible academic institution, the preservation of freedom of speech is massive. Some Israeli institutions like the Hebrew U, of course, have faced international pushback over their, from the BDS movement, but even for the rational actors who are collaborating, researching with institutions like Hebrew U, hosting their academics, engaging with them on good faith apart from the political system. If the Israeli academics feel muzzled, that they can't say things, the government pushes in aggressive defamation law, you can't write policy against the government in any Israeli academic institution, then the international standing of Israel's institutions will go down. One. Reason two is because a lot of these academics are left-leaning politically, it's going to spark brain drain. And that's also connected to the high-tech dynamic. Is Israel, for the past number of years, has seen declining scores in STEM subjects, the scientific, mathematical, technology subjects that form the basis for future careers in these tech industries. So given that our talent pool is sort of education-wise, there are signs of trouble. If the academia also abandons ship, again, it's another potential of cause of concern for Israel. I spoke as well to someone from the LGBT/gay community who said that they were worried, extremely worried. They up to now had not spoken at these protests out of a sense of fear. They think that fear is well founded, and the woman I spoke to quite colorfully described the current government as a group of homophobes. And she has a point. I don't know if that can be said about everyone in government, everyone in the coalition, but there are certainly unapologetic, explicit homophobes holding ministerial positions in government. And of course, if you're from that community, which is a minority in Israel, then that's scary because the government can do what it wants now. It can, they attempted last year to slow down the passage of surrogacy. What's going to be next for the LGBT community? So basically, without going into any one group in big detail, there was a lot of people from different sectors here. There was even some religious Jews who were not from one of these groups, but just felt that this proposed legislation ran contrary to Judaism, so they had to make a showing. My feeling, again, personally, is that, well, if you look at Israel's electorate, it's right-wing, it's nationalistic, particularly as you go down into the younger demographics. And my feeling, honestly, I'll just put it out there, I think Israel's democracy has been always tinged with theocracy, always tinged with the this problem of how can we preserve the state as a Jewish state while having democracy, because you can't really have one with the other, right? If it's democracy, if the birth rate of Arabs exceeds Jews by fivefold and it becomes a minority Arab country, then under democracy, the Arabs vote out the Jews and decide to change the name of the country to Palestine, and Israel as the Jewish state is gone out the window. So there's always been, I think, these fundamental problems of Israel saying that's what we want to go for is Western democracy. And I think these are just coming to the fore. I don't think these judicial review proposals, I think it's the straw that broke the camel's basket. It's indicative of much bigger problems in Israeli society, including our lack of constitution, of a clear constitution, including the massive divisiveness between the different groups. The civil war stuff isn't exaggerated. Today there was a counter protest in Jerusalem with people saying, well, we support the judiciary. Sorry, it should be, we are in favor of these proposals. The judiciary should be much, much more closely regulated. And people were screaming and, giving them the middle finger. And it was like, there was like a ring of police just to sort of protect them. So the disagreement and the actual hatred at this point, the real hatred internally in Israeli society is kind of ferocious. And it does, another word that President Herzog used is a powder keg. So it doesn't seem exaggerated. When you read statements from politicians, sometimes one thinks, well, it's a little bit perhaps colorful in their language, but I think this is a case where it's a real thing. Where will it go from here? The passage of the legislation has been kind of slowed down a little. The government has said, let's talk, let's meet about it. Those opposed have said, well, we're not going to meet unless you firstly commit to pause the advance of the legislation, because otherwise this is just a ruse. And so there's been a little bit of jolting today, I would say, as a result of these protests, but nothing yet that said, nothing very far from the government saying, oh, we didn't think 100,000 people would come out. Sorry. You don't want that. It's going out the window, and because a lot of people do want this, and it is, as I mentioned, my feeling is that, look, Israel's young, has always been theocracy. Elements of theocracy, Jewish law, do permeate life in Israel. There is, the public transport that can't operate on the Shabbat. There has been legislation, saying that Judaism is the official heritage of Israel. It's a blurry line already. And in Israel and in the Middle East, it's a neighborhood dominated by dictatorships and autocrats. And perhaps this is a system Israel needs to survive. Perhaps this is the one that for Zionists mirrors best the system of governance we saw in the times of the Tanakh. And that's why people are rooting for it. So there's all these possibilities under the surface, and dialogue that needs to be held, and where it's going is where I'll stop, because I think it would be crazy to predict. I will just say two things. Daniel's bright ideas for this situation. I think Israel democracy is going to be not destroyed but undermined. Two suggestions I have for the Israeli government is as follows. One, condense the basic laws to a constitution. That could be the work that probably would have to be the work of something like a committee to look at that corpus and bring it down to one document, because when we're talking about what's constitutional versus unconstitutional, so much easier to reference one document for not just lawyers but for lay people who don't have necessarily the abilities to go saying which are the basic laws exactly. That would be number one. And direct democracy, referenda, a thing I grew up with in Ireland. If you want to change the constitution, the Oireachtas, the government makes laws. Okay, there we have judicial review, but for the most part, the laws are passed. However, in addition to law, we have a supreme court. We have a supreme source of domestic law in the form of the Constitution. In Ireland's case, it's also got international law and EU law, which we don't have here in Israel. The EU law aspect, I mean. But there is no. But we don't have this system whereby if you want to change, here's what's fundamental, and if you want to change it, there is a constitutionally guaranteed mechanism called a referendum or a plebiscite that you're going to have an opportunity beyond regular fixed elections to make your voice heard, and we'll have a referendum on this issue. In general, there's a massive democratic deficit in Israel. The politicians are elected based on party lists rather than on constituencies, as I grew up in Ireland. So there's no accountability in the system. You don't have a local MK, as in Ireland you might have a local TD, or in the UK your local MP who represents your group. So it kind of, the whole idea of politics in Israel is a bit funny. We vote on big issues We don't vote on really what's happening in our we vote on their security policy, and we end up as the people, as the electorate, having this very sort of stark disconnect between what we want and need in our daily lives and in our localities, and the Knesset, which seems to be either just talking about macro issues or bickering and infighting, one of the two, and neither really helps us. So at the 30-minute mark, I'm going to retire to hopefully to bed for the evening. Those are my thoughts on all these developments going on in Israel. As I always say, I hope they were interesting. Feel free to disagree with my strident opinion with more strident opinions. And if you do want to get more videos from me about stuff related to Jerusalem, Israel, the impending collapse of Israel, of the democracy, I mean, the seeming impending collapse of the world, it feels like that a bit at the moment, doesn't it? Then occasionally I might post these musings, and I will try to do so in a slightly more organized format next time as well. And if you do want to get in touch with me, besides the comment section, click onto the About link, and I do have an email there that will reach me via my huge network of aides. I'm just kidding. I clearly don't have aides or secretaries. It will get to me, and if I have time, I will respond. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.